then you definitely need to let me know. Um, we're at the end of the semester, and the end of the book starts getting into social behavior, and they actually have a couple of chapters on social behavior. And I'm not going to try and race through this topic to squeeze it in here at the end, but I do want to at least introduce you to the idea of social behavior. So, when you hear the word altruism, what do you think of?
Usually like kind acts, but
Where you don't receive any benefit, I think, is what you're getting at. Yeah. So oftentimes when we think of altruistic acts in humans, it's where you, the human, give something up with no expectation of reciprocity. You guys know what I mean by reciprocity? Yeah, like I'm gonna give you money for a car because then 3 years from now you'll give me money for a house. That's reciprocity. Um, so this is how we think of altruism in human beings. How would you? How do you think that changes when we think about altruism in organisms, not non-human animals? Okay, so let's talk about parents and offspring. When a parent does something for an offspring, like feed them, this is costing the parent something, right? But in this case, the parents are getting something in return. What are they getting in return? Yeah, those offspring are their fitness. If you lay an egg that you've invested energy in, and then after that egg hatches into a hatchling, and then you just neglect it and don't feed it, it dies, and you've now invested energy into the beginnings of that offspring's life, but you don't achieve any fitness because that individual offspring didn't survive. So when we think about parents and offspring, this would not be considered altruism because the reason that the parent is feeding the offspring is because that's their direct measure of fitness. So this kind of gets us into one of the fundamental ways in which we can think about altruism in non-human animals differently from how we think about them in humans. What's that difference? I went on a charity ride this past weekend. I paid a registration. My registration for that charity ride does not cover it cover that it's way more than the cost of the people actually putting on the ride. And so whatever above and beyond that the registration was, or above and beyond what it cost to put on the ride, that goes to the charity. So I think the ride was $40. Let's say that it cost $5 per rider because you scale it up to a bunch of riders. $5 per rider to put on the ride. That means that there's $35 left over that go directly to charity. Now, I did this and I got something out of it. I got a wickedly hard course out of it, and I got some support. But all the support was also donated. Martin City Brewery donated food. Other places donated this and that and the other thing, which is what reduces the cost of putting this thing on per rider. But this goes to charity. This was for the Hope Center down in Kansas City, which is a charity that helps people who are homeless find affordable housing. Um, I hope I never need to rely on the Hope Center to find affordable housing. So this would be considered altruism because I'm giving up money to an organization from which I don't ever expect anything out of them. Um, and so there is no expectation of reciprocity. But in this case, the currency here is actually money. What would the currency be if we were thinking about this in non-human organisms? Energy, time, those could all be currencies, but I'm thinking of a more inclusive sort of currency. You know, what happens if you don't feed the offspring? They die, and so you have no fitness. So in this case, one way to define altruism would be what in terms of fitness? So you give up fitness. So this would be a way of thinking about altruism in non-human organisms. But then we can illustrate this with a classic example from human beings. What would be an example of this in human beings, do you think? It's like a classic stereotypical human occurrence. We sometimes call these people heroes because they do this. Hmm? I'm not thinking surrogates because you're getting something in return for that. You're hopefully somebody. If you're being a surrogate, hopefully somebody is paying you a ton of money to do that. Um, Kids playing on a lake, ice-covered lake, either early in the winter or late into the spring. The kid falls through the ice. Passerby in a car sees the kid struggling to get out of the icy waters of the pond. What does the stranger do? Goes out onto the, what's that? Keeps driving? Did you say keeps driving? um,
There's our spite.
wow. Well, spider indifference. I think it's more indifference than spite. Wow. And we gain insight into Mason. Um, the person goes out onto the ice, jumps into the hole in the ice, pushes the kid up onto the ice, but in the process dies. It's not your child. It's not your nephew. It's not your cousin. You've given up all of your fitness and you don't have any relatedness to that individual whatsoever. It is a purely altruistic thing. Now, you may be celebrated in the newspaper and be called a hero, etc., but you're dead. You don't get any of the advantages of being hailed as a hero. You're dead. This would be kind of the equivalent of how we think of altruism in organisms, in non-human organisms. How often do you think this actually happens? Probably not very often in human terms, because when that happens, it makes the news. Why? Yeah, why does it make the news? Why do we hear about it? Huh? Because it doesn't happen very often. For one, you need exceptional circumstances, and two, you need the person to not just drive on in that exceptional circumstance. You need somebody other than Mason to be driving by at that moment. Okay. Impressive. Then you would get all the accolades, and so you would have something to gain. And it may be that the person thinks the way Mason is, well, I'm going to save the kid, and I'm not going to die, and then ends up dying when they thought that they weren't going to, in which case, even then, it wouldn't have been an altruistic bent on this person's an altruistic motivation, it would have been like, oh, if I jump in the water and save the kid, oh, I'm going to be a hero because I'm never going to die in the icy waters because I'm better than that. Except I wasn't, and now I'm dead. So when we think about altruism, either in humans or in non-human animals, oftentimes the altruism that we see isn't actually true altruism because oftentimes the individual who is presumably doing the altruistic act is actually benefiting in some way from the altruistic act. So we have to kind of sort this out. So Davies et al., all throughout your book, they argue over and over and over again that organisms should be selfish in their behavioral actions. Why? Why would that be the standard argument in behavioral ecology? Yeah, you're trying to increase your fitness, and anything that you do that lowers your fitness, evolution should select against. And so we should generally see selfish behavior evolving. But there were examples of cooperation that we've covered so far in the course. What are some of them? One we talked about relatively recently. Covered it recently under the resource enhancement hypothesis. Hmm? What's that? No, this was in the section on sex allocation. What do you remember from group living?
They work together, like to have a better chances at foraging and to reduce predation.
Okay, so you might work as a group because you have a better chance of catching food, or you can catch food and handle food that is much larger than yourself. But that cooperation benefits, of course, everybody in the group, right? You're not really giving anything up by engaging in that kind of cooperative behavior. So we wouldn't consider that cooperative behavior altruism because the reason that you're cooperating is that there is something in it for you, the individual. Forage as a group versus forage alone. Forage alone, I get a certain amount. Forage as a group, if we all bring down a much bigger prey item, then we all get, per individual, a bigger chunk of energy and nutrients out of the deal.
So, sorry, just so I understand. For this question, are you asking for?
I'm asking for examples. What
So
examples? Yeah,
of
just examples
cooperation,
that we've
not
talked
ones
about.
that are specifically altruistic.
No, just
Okay.
cooperation that we've come across.
Is this not like the bees?
Social foraging.
This not the bees.
What about the bees?
Like when they, like how they choose, like what sex, like the queen.
So in that case, the queen is acting selfishly, and also her offspring, the daughters who are doing all of the work in the hive, are also acting selfishly. So they're both acting selfishly, and they kind of meet in the middle where sex ratio is concerned. Now, I wouldn't consider that cooperative behavior. That's selfish behavior that results in an equilibrium. But they do cooperative foraging. So everybody in the hive goes out and forages. But the reason that everybody in the hive goes out and forages is because all of that energy and nutrients that they're bringing back to the hive, that is actually benefiting their kin, their individuals in the hive that are related to them. And the relatedness is high in those social insect species. So in all of these cases of cooperation that we studied before, there is either something tangible in it for you, the individual, or there is something tangible in it for one of your relatives. So if you are driving down the road, you see a kid that fell through the ice, and you know that your nephew was out ice skating that day, and then you see his head pop up, and you're like, that's my nephew. In theory, you should be more likely to jump into the lake and save that child than you would a perfect stranger's child because you share some genetic relatedness with that individual. So that even if you die, there's some portion of your genome present in that individual that gets to go on and later reproduce. This is the concept of inclusive fitness. And so one of the reasons that we see true acts of altruism out in nature is that when we start to delve into the underlying genetics of the individuals involved in those interactions, is we oftentimes find that these individuals end up being related. So as we think about these different kinds of interactions, it's beneficial to think about who benefits from the cooperation. Is it the actor doing the cooperation or the recipient of the cooperative behavior? And so who do these fitness consequences accrue to? The actor or the recipient or both? And there are direct fitness benefits in that I do something and it benefits me and my fitness directly. And there are, of course, indirect fitness benefits that benefit somebody that you are genetically related to, but not you directly. So we can think about this. This is a table from your book. We can think about this in terms of the effect on the actor, positive effects versus negative effects, and the effect on the recipient. For positive effects on the recipient, if you do something as an actor that benefits you and benefits somebody else, this is mutually beneficial to the two of you. Not hard to understand why organisms would engage in a mutually beneficial sort of behavior. But if you engage in a behavior that negatively affects your fitness and positively affects somebody else's fitness, that would be true altruism because it negatively affects you and positively affects somebody else. Seemingly apparent altruistic acts done by individual actors for the benefit of relatives would fall under the mutually beneficial sort of thing, sort of side of things, because it's negative, potentially negative for you, but it potentially benefits you in terms of indirect effects on your relatives. A positive act of an actor that has negative effects on the recipient would be viewed as selfish behavior, and a negative effect of an actor that has a negative effect on a recipient would be a spiteful sort of interaction. So it's pretty easy to understand mutually beneficial and selfish behaviors. It's harder to understand altruistic and spiteful behaviors, which is why your book spends a whole chapter on altruism and spite. Altruism, where you take a fitness hit to benefit somebody else, and spite, where you take a negative hit just so you can inflict a negative hit on somebody else. Mason is smiling because he's thinking about examples.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of it. I don't know why you would surely take, surely that plays into inclusive fitness somehow, because if you take a hit just to, knock someone else down, that would then benefit someone of your.
Yeah, so this table really does speak mostly to unrelated individuals. So, and this also makes certain assumptions about whether or not you're going to come into contact with these individuals again in the future. So remember that when we talked about game theory it seems like forever ago now, we talked about game theory as a way of thinking about the decisions that individuals make. And we talked about the prisoner's dilemma, and we talked about the difference between normal criminals and mob families. And we said that mob families, members of mobs, are way less likely to defect when caught in the commission of a crime than unrelated individuals. And part of that is that the individuals involved are in many cases members of the same family, so they share genetic relatedness. But the other thing that makes it different is that it's an iterative game rather than a one-off game. You're going to come into contact with these people over and over and over and over again. And this leads to what is referred to in the literature as tit for tat games. Do you guys remember this terminology? A tit for tat game is a evolutionary game in which your behavior mirrors whatever behavior is being exhibited towards you. So if I give Avery candy when we meet because Avery is a good student and she's pleasant in class, and that's kind of a reward for behavior. And then what she does is whenever she sees me, she gives me some candy, and then I give her some candy, and then she gives me some candy. Before you know it, we are very unhealthy individuals. As opposed to, I go up to Mason and I whack him across the face because he does stuff like drive past drowning kids and just keeps driving. Then the next time he sees me, he whacks me across the face for no other reason than that I whacked him across the face first. These are tit for tat behaviors. And one of the nice things about tit for tat behaviors is if something good is done, that kind of perpetuates the good. The bad thing about it is when something bad is done, that perpetuates the bad. But they're really easy for animals to process cognitively because it requires actually less decision making than some of the more complicated game theoretical scenarios that we've talked about. And so you oftentimes see what could be a more complex behavior in animals devolving into tit for tat simply because in some ways it's just easier. Um, and what happens in a tit for tat game is it can sometimes be going one way for a while, and then one individual in the game um, changes the rules, does the other behavior, and then all of a sudden you're now in a long running, whatever the opposite behavior is. But those tit for tat games make an assumption. They make the assumption that those two actors are going to come into contact with one another again in the future. And that changes the dynamics of it. In that case, it's much better to err on the side of doing the beneficial action rather than erring on the side of doing the selfish or spiteful action. Um, so we can also think of all of this in a game theoretical context for clarity as well. Um, we oftentimes talk about this in terms of other animals, but this also plays out in humans. And as a matter of fact, game theoretical approaches were originally devised to look at human behavior. And they were used by economists to look at economic decisions that humans make. And they were adapted during the Cold War to look at geopolitical issues. How should one nation deal with another nation in terms of how we acted? And in the Cold War, especially back when the United States and what is now Russia were at odds with one another over nuclear armament, the Defense Department employed a ton of game theoreticians working on this interaction between the United States and Russia in terms of what should the American response be to things that the Russians do, and what would you expect the Russian response be to things that Americans do, and the American government does, and not individual Americans. And basically, we got into this evolutionary arms race, this nuclear arms race, where both countries now have tens of thousands of nuclear warheads at their disposal because we found ourselves involved in a tit for tat game. We developed the atomic bomb. Then after World War II, that put pressure on Russia to develop their own nuclear weapons. We had the uranium-plutonium bomb. Then they had the uranium-plutonium bomb. We then developed the hydrogen bomb, which was more powerful. Then they developed the hydrogen bomb. Then we made the hydrogen bomb smaller so that you can mount it on a missile, so you don't even need a plane to deliver it to where it's at. They developed bombs that were smaller so you could mount them on the tips of missiles so that they could send them to us. We made our missiles better so that we didn't have to have missiles located on the West Coast. We could have missiles located in the central portion of the United States. So they were longer range. Then they developed those. And then at that point, it was just kind of a question of, well, now we can send our missiles to anywhere in Russia. Russia can send their missiles to anywhere in the United States. So now the question is just, well, how many do we need? And so we made more, which then made them make more, which made us make more, which made them make more. And so we were in this tit for tat evolutionary game that escalated the whole thing into the point that finally in the 1970s and 80s, people were like, whoa, you guys have so many nuclear warheads that you can annihilate one another many times over. This is ridiculous. And so they got together, the strategic arms limitation talks, got Russian and U.S. negotiators at the table, and they all said to one another, this is crazy. Let's start turning this down. And we set upon a course of each year, each country reduces their nuclear arsenal a little bit. Then there were the SALT II talks, further talks that occurred later after the first SALT talks that reduced warheads even more. And once again, we were in a tit for tat sort of situation because we said we would reduce, which then created an incentive for the Russians to say, okay, we'll reduce also, which then gives us incentive to say, okay, we'll reduce further if you reduce further. And so these tit for tat games can go one direction for long periods of time, but those can also turn around by basically one actor doing something that then turns that particular tit for tat game around. You know, we see this all over human interactions. Employee loses his job after 20 years of working someplace and then on his last day of work burns the plant down. Spite. You've done something negative to your employer because they've done something negative to you. It's a tit for tat kind of thing. But the negative thing that you do for them is also really negative for you because you go to jail for arson. So we can also think of these kinds of social behaviors in terms of human interactions as well as non-human animal interactions.
Would you ever compare tit for tat to
So in this case, because it's behavioral and it's a tit for tat, it can develop into an arms race. Normally, if we think of arms races like leading to runaway selection of sexually selected characters and things like that, we wouldn't think that as a tit for tat because it's not really game theoretical kind of construct. It's just straight evolution. Yeah. It's a decent question, but yeah, it's different. So when we think about these seemingly or apparently altruistic activities of non-human animals towards one another, it's always good to check the relatedness of individuals because of what's known as kin selection and inclusive fitness. So kin selection is just a type of selection where natural selection might favor a particular set of behaviors that might reduce the fitness of one individual, but that individual gains indirect fitness gains because that activity gains its relatives. So parental care would be one of these examples, one form of giving aid to another, but in the end, it actually increases the fitness of the individual. And so those are direct genetic benefits to the parent as a result of parental care. When we think of inclusive fitness, though, we think of an actor doing something beneficial that serves the recipient of the offspring of another individual, and the degree to which it benefits the original actor is all due to how much relatedness you share with those offspring of somebody else's. And so if this recipient is a total stranger, then R would be 0, and so the fitness gains through indirect fitness would be 0. However, if the recipient of the altruism is the child of your brother, there's a certain amount of relatedness such that the relatedness you have with this individual multiplied times whatever the fitness gain that individual gets would be added to your direct fitness through indirect fitness, so you can actually have fitness gains beyond your own offspring because you are helping the offspring of relatives. And so this is where inclusive fitness comes from, this combination of direct fitness from your own reproduction versus increasing the fitness of other individuals that you are related to. I hadn't noticed that, but it's a little disturbing, I guess. So,
So in terms of parental care, would altruism apply to like step sons and stuff? Like, because they're not technically your offspring.
I was thinking too.
yeah, so in that case, in a strict genetic sense, no, that's a pretty altruistic thing to do because those individuals aren't genetically related to you at all. Now,
To
so
some
so
extent, you still get like benefit. I mean, like I know that, but I mean like genetically.
yeah, so genetically, no, there's no advantage to that. And if we're talking about non-human animals, there's zero sense in an individual caring for offspring that are not genetically their own.
So
We've
then that doesn't ever happen.
And we've talked about some cases in which this does happen, but oftentimes that happens because of things like extra pair matings, where the individual providing the parental care has no way of knowing that those aren't actually his offspring. And so then there's deception in there.
But that's not
And
like true altruism because they think they're getting something out of it.
they do think they're getting something out of it. And it, yeah, so no, yeah, the the individual does not know that he or she is doing something that benefits the fitness of another unrelated individual. They think it's their own individual, their own offspring. Um, Now, in a human sense, since you've asked the question, it could be that if you have children of your own, your wife dies or you get divorced or whatever, and then you marry somebody else and she has offspring, so now you have stepchildren, and you treat those stepchildren really, really bad, such that she doesn't want to have anything to do with you anymore. You could be sacrificing your own future fitness if part of the activities that she does not engage with you is having children with you. So you always have to think those things through clearly as a human actor. But yeah, generally, if you take on a stepchild, that would be interpreted by a behavioral ecologist as an altruistic act because there's no genetic, indirect genetic fitness benefits for you, the actor. So, there's a guy named Hamilton who did a lot of work with social behavior back in the 60s. Um, he thought about inclusive fitness and he kind of broke it down. You can think about the benefit to the recipient, the cost incurred by the actor, and the coefficient of relatedness. So you should be able to do a cost-benefit analysis on altruistic behavior just like you would do on anything else. And so what he basically figured out is that the ratio of the benefit to cost should be greater than the ratio of 1 over R. So if your relatedness to an individual is 0.5, then the benefit to cost ratio should basically be 2 times, the benefit is 2 times the cost in this scenario because 1 divided by 0.5 is 2. And so you should be able to predict when individuals will behave in a particular way just by looking at the cost of benefit of the action and relatedness of the individual to the recipient. And so you can, once again, move this all around and figure out an equation for um, when the benefit times the relatedness minus C, this has to be greater than 0. So there has to be a net benefit to the recipient of the behavior, and that net benefit, as it's weighted by relatedness, has to be big enough that it is higher than the cost. So if we take this individual who is half related, that would be 0.5 times the benefit minus the cost. This has to be greater than 0. So if the benefit was 2, then this would be 2 times 1/2, and the cost would be 1 here. This benefit, 2 times a half, is 1 minus 1, that equals 0. So this represents the threshold at which this behavior would happen. So That's the math of it. So then the question is, how does one calculate relatedness? Let's skip the meerkats. Let's talk about how we calculate relatedness. So this is a figure from your textbook. And the way we calculate relatedness is by building a diagram of relatedness, essentially. So this works for sexually reproducing organisms. So if you have a dad and a mom, and they give rise to offspring of whatever gender, it doesn't really matter. It's because of meiosis, half of your genes go into this offspring, and half of the mom's genes go into this offspring. So the relatedness in here is 0.5. But really, this is essentially, what's the relatedness between the father and the offspring? Well, the relatedness between the father and the offspring is 0.5. There's one link between this parent and this offspring, and there's only one path. So the way to calculate relatedness is the number of paths to get to that offspring times the relatedness from one individual to the other individual, and then how many links there are in that path. So for parents, it's pretty easy. Parents to offspring. But if we want to compare offspring to one another, offspring 1 here gets genes from the mom, or it gets genes from the dad, and also gets genes from the mom. And this offspring gets genes from the dad and also gets genes from the mom. And so in this case, if we want to look at the relatedness between offspring 1 and offspring 2, we can go offspring 1 to the dad to offspring 2, but we can also go offspring 1 to the mom to offspring 2. So there are two paths. Each of these paths is half relatedness here and half relatedness here, two links in that path, and also two links in that path. And so we have the relatedness is 0.5 and the number of links connecting them are 2. So we can do this if the paths are the same links. We can do this by multiplying the number of paths times that thing. The other thing we can do is we can just sum the relatedness times the number of links across however many paths that we have. So for example, there may be situations where there's a path that is 2 links long versus a path that is three links long. We wouldn't be able to just multiply those together. We would actually have to have the 2 path plus the 3 path. But this is how you figure it out. And so for offspring, for siblings, the relatedness would be 2 times 0.5 squared. 0.5 squared is 0.25 times 2. 0.25 times 2 is 0.5. So we have a 0.5 relatedness between siblings, which is what is shown here. And so this chart in your book basically just refers to how you find relatedness between different pairs of individuals. So in this case, cousins, you have 2 siblings. Oh, sorry. The parents are siblings. The siblings have parents. And so in this case, sibling 1 has an offspring. These 2 individuals are cousins, and they share essentially grandparents because these grandparents gave rise to both of these individuals. And so there's only one path from this individual to this individual that includes the other individual, the other cousin. These individuals are married to one another, have mated with one another, but that doesn't factor in because these individuals are genetically unrelated to anybody that connects them over here. So you can get to this cousin, from this cousin to this cousin, by going to that parent, that grandparent, that parent to them. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 paths. You can also go from here to this parent, to that grandparent, to that parent, to there. So there are 2 different paths. The relatedness along each step of the path is 0.5, but there are 4 links in each path. And so that's how you would get the relatedness among cousins of 12.5%, essentially. So this is how you go through figuring out relatedness. Yeah.
So for example, like a test question or something about this, you would give us a diagram something like that and say figure out the relatedness
Sure.
between these two.
Yeah, that would be a fair question. Now, here's a real life scenario. My sister died. So this is Paul. This is Michelle, and they spelled her name with one L. My dad's name is Philip. My mom's name is Julia. Paul has 0 kids, so there's nothing underneath him. Michelle has 2 kids, Ethan and Megan. So I share genetic relatedness with Ethan and Megan. Michelle married a guy named James, who's no longer really in the picture. So in both cases, these individuals are related to James. So I'm related to my dad by 50%. Michelle is related to my dad by 50%, and Michelle is related to each of these individuals by 50%. They're my niece and nephew. But I'm also related to my mom by 50%. My mom is related to my sister by 50%, and then my sister is related to each of these individuals. So to get from me to my niece and nephew, I have 1, 2, 3 links. The relatedness along each of those links is 0.5, and 1, 2, 3 links. So I have 2 paths to get there. And so that would be, what's 0.5? So 0.5 squared is 0.25 times 0.5. 5, 2, 10, 12. 0.125, but that's 0.125 times 2. 0.125 times 2 is equal to 0.25. So I have 1/4 relatedness between me and my niece and nephew. Before you accept after C. Now, she died. She died of methicillin-resistant staph infection in 2005. What?
Links are through the arrows, right? So like counting arrows.
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And then paths are basically, okay.
Yeah. So this is a path with 3 links. Path 1 link, 2 link, 3 link. Path 1 link, 2 links, 3 links. So she died of methicillin-resistant staph, and after she died, we had to get together and figure out what's going to happen to Ethan and Megan. I have 2 other siblings, Teresa and Elizabeth. I have a sibling named Elizabeth, and I remember the conversation. We were in a Waffle House eating the worst cherry pie that I've ever had, basically talking to my siblings about what will happen to these 2 kids. And I was in a postdoc. No, I wasn't in a postdoc. I was here at the time, but I traveled a lot with research and things like this. In the end, we kind of tried to think of what was best for the 2 kids in terms of people not moving around a lot. I didn't have tenure yet at this institution, so I might have been moving at a moment's notice. But my older sister and her husband were very stable in their jobs. They'd been living in their house for a while. They weren't planning on, they still live in that same house after all this time. Um, and so we made a decision that was very, very pragmatic, but from an evolutionary standpoint, I would have to ascertain what are the benefits to these two children based on the costs, and I would have to know that that is greater than the relatedness. In this case, the relatedness of one child, which is 1 over 0.25 plus 1 over 0.25. 1 over 0.25 is 4 plus 1 over 0.25 is 4. So that relatedness then is 8, which means that the cost to benefit ratio here has to be really, really high in order for me to agree to take on these two kids. And it's not me driving by and just ignoring the drowning kid. It's actually a cost benefit analysis on whether or not you should enter into this. Now, because we're humans and we don't make decisions on these bases, I wasn't sitting there in the just a second, I got to calculate relatedness here and see if this is really worth it to me. But because of this, this would be the calculation that presumably evolution would be using to drive decision making in organisms. Because we're humans, we don't really think about that. We just thought, what's best for for these two kids, regardless of what the cost is to the people engaging in this. But this would be one way of making that decision in the Waffle House at midnight. Well, because it was midnight, because we had just buried my sister, because I was in Puerto Rico with 9 William Jewell College students setting up this gigantic experiment. One of them, luckily, was older. He now teaches at the University of Idaho. He's a professor now, a very successful professor. He had been in the military prior to coming back to school at William Jewell College. He was 27. He was very responsible. I basically left Puerto Rico, flew back to Texas, where all my family lives, left him in charge of finishing getting the experiment set up, with 8 of his classmates driving the van, making sure that everybody was fed and taken care of well, etc., etc. And it's midnight. We had just buried my sister. We had to make this decision. And after the decision was over, the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, I was flying back to Puerto Rico to be with my students who I had hauled to Puerto Rico under the assumption that I would be there the whole time. So that's why we found ourselves at a Waffle House, judgy. Oh my gosh. So in reality, the cherry pie was we're in the Waffle House because that's the only place open like at midnight in Copperas Cove, Texas, which is a little know-nothing town. And we couldn't just sit there and have this conversation at the tables without buying something. So we just bought an entire cherry pie and split it amongst us so that we would have something to justify our presence in the Waffle House. And then because it's sitting there in front of you and it's now midnight and you're kind of hungry, you try and eat it and it was just unpalatable.
I think Waffle House is pretty decent, honestly.
It's decent for some things. This particular pie was not.
I just like never ate at a Waffle House.
Was not very good.
When I'm drunk, it's yeah, but they got some really banging breakfast food, and they're open when other places aren't open.
They are open when other places are not open. See,
Eggs.
Avery understands the situation
It's either Taco
perfectly.
Bell, like if you're gonna sit somewhere, it's gotta be Waffle House.
All right.
Things are open, but you can't go back.
But
So-
Taco Bell also sucks.
But this is the point. As a behavioral ecologist, this is how you would calculate the math on what the correct decision is to make.
So how do you quantify like benefits?
I was just about to ask.
So you would have to ask what the benefits are to the individual, and when we're thinking about this evolutionarily, you would think about fitness benefits. And so in this case, the benefits for these two kids is, are they going to get enough enough care and feeding and everything else in an evolutionary sense that they reach sexual maturity and then reproduce successfully. That's kind of when the parental job is over from a fitness perspective. Once again, if we were thinking of this strictly in biological terms, quite frankly, one of the conversations that we had in the process of doing, so we did do a little bit of a cost benefit analysis. I teach at a university. My offspring, whether they are adopted or biological, get tuition remission. So there was a huge benefit of me taking those kids, just thinking further down the line, I'm the one who has the best possibility of giving them access to a college education. And so we figured out, we factored all of this in, and we made a particular decision, whether that was the best decision or not. So in a human perspective, you would try and think about all these costs and benefits that go way beyond fitness. But from a bird's perspective, all that matters really is what's the fitness consequences to the offspring. And when you think about fitness benefits versus costs, you're thinking about the benefits in fitness to the recipient and the cost to the individual engaging in altruism, presumed altruism. And then the math becomes a little easier because birds aren't thinking about college tuition. There's some underground college university that birds go to. Yeah. I'm telling you that I'm not aware of one. So anyway, we have this level of relatedness, and this level of relatedness then affects decision making. So when we think about something like alarm calling, we can put a stuffed badger, on a piece of board and drag it through a field around where we have marmots. Was this a marmot? Oh no, prairie dogs. And when the prairie dogs see a predator, they give off an alarm call. And of course, they are way more likely to give off alarm calls in areas where they are closely related to the other prairie dogs around them. That should not surprise us one iota. Because if you're in a colony of prairie dogs where relatedness is high, even if you making the alarm call alerts the badger to your location and he comes and kills and eats you, as long as all of the members of your family have made it to safety as a result of your alarm call, you could actually achieve higher fitness through inclusive fitness gains than if you didn't do the alarm call. And the badger came through and killed, 5 of your nephews. And so all of these things can be viewed through this idea of what are the direct fitness costs and benefits to you versus what are the indirect fitness costs and benefits to the recipients of your actions. Those two things go together to form all of inclusive fitness. And an organism should be striving to not only increase their direct fitness, but also their inclusive fitness. And I think what we will do is we will just leave it at there. I think that is all. So think about spite as well, even though we haven't talked about it much at all. But spite doesn't make a lot of evolutionary sense, simply because it costs you fitness and doesn't benefit, and costs the other individual fitness as well. And so we should expect to see that even more rarely in populations than we see altruism or apparent altruism. Once again, that would be a very human perspective on spite. I have your literature summaries. They're getting better. Yeah.
Honestly, this one was really hard.
Links. Yeah, because you didn't do a very good job of condensing. 2 pages, right?
Oh, my bad.
Yeah, you're bad. You know what the specification is.
I didn't realize there was a limit to pages. I just thought it had to be at least 2 pages.
Nope, we've had this conversation.
I even want to try to change my margins to make it more than 2 pages
No. Do better.
Well, I hope I wasn't that cross about it.
It was a really long paper though.
Yeah,
It was.
It
And
was
they
for
did
this
a
exact
lot of
one. It was
stuff.
for this exact one that I wanted to change the module.
How,
It was around 60 pages.
how did the exams look?
I'm still working on them, so I don't